In DC Comics, Joshua Williamson's expansion of the science of the Speed Force has very famously come with the introduction of 3 new universal forces that are meant to describe the observable behavior of physics in the world. The Sage Force, which manifests psychic energy, the Strength Force, which imbues super strength and gravity manipulation, and the Still Force, which pushes the universe farther towards its inevitable state of entropy. The most recent story arcs of Williamson's run on The Flash have seen the hero experiment, harness, and try to address the presence of these new forces in the universe. And it's certainly made for fascinating expansions to the long-established DC lore, but I'd argue that there's a far more structured and designed organization to how these 4 forces are behaving with one another. They seem to be affecting each other at a core level sometimes, canceling each other out in some cases, and interweaving their forces to bring forth something new altogether. Happily enough, there's a specific field of study one could use to explore and represent the mechanics of these 4 forces. It's a subject that's algebraic at its core, but still not too entrenched in arbitrary complexity that it's hard to get into. This field of study is called group theory, the mathematical exploration of ordered patterns in a system. Chapter 1: A Geometric Introduction to Group Theory. Now, for a quick crash course introduction to what a group is in mathematics. It's a way of understanding a set of objects, numbers, or actions that relate to each other in a sort of algebraic way. For an intuitive example, the collection of transformations we could make to a triangle so that it ends up with the same silhouetted orientation can be considered a group. In this case, there are 6 transformations we can make to any triangle. Flip it over its top corners axis, flip it over its bottom left corners axis, flip it over its bottom right corners axis, rotate it 120 degrees, rotate it 240 degrees, and rotate it 360 degrees, which is the same as if we had never rotated it at all. This group of 6 actions, or elements, is what's called the symmetry group of the triangle, since they're changes we can make to a triangle that ends up preserving its general symmetry. Now, if you can generally follow along with this stripped-down explanation, then you conceptually understand group theory. And if not, then hopefully my explanation with the Speed Force will help clear some things up. Chapter 2: The Negative Speed Force and Inverse Elements. Now, what I've found to be very charming about The Flash before the events of Williamson's run is that writers prior were already laying the foundations of group theory within the mechanics of the Speed Force, by way of the introduction of the famed Reverse Flash villain Eobard Thawne and his Negative Speed Force. In the terminology of group theory, the Negative Speed Force plays a critical role in the laws of group theory. That law being that for every element in a group, there must also exist what's called an inverse element. The idea behind the existence of an inverse element is that if an element were to be applied with its inverse, then the 2 elements would sort of cancel each other out and yield what's called the identity element, a sort of null element that doesn't change any other element it's applied to. For example, using the symmetry group of triangles, the 0 or 360 degree rotation is the identity element of the group because it doesn't change the triangle at all. It's like it leaves the figure untouched. But returning to the law of inverse elements, the idea is that every element in a group must have an inverse. Now, taking into account the other 3 forces of Williamson's Force Wars, the laws of group theory logically conclude that there must also exist inverses to the Strength, Sage, and Still forces, which I would love to see any writer explore and flesh out. But at this point, I am indulging in fanfiction, albeit mathematically justified fanfiction. The best kind of fanfiction. However, I didn't bring up the Negative Speed Force just for fan speculation about the negative Strength, Sage, and Still forces. Instead, Williamson's writing so far seems to suggest a relationship between the newly discovered forces and the negative speed force that has algebraic justification through group theory. Chapter 3: Death and the Speed Force and Closure. In Williamson's later story arc, Death and the Speed Force, Barry Allen scrambles to stop the Black Flash, the manifestation of death for all speedsters. However, it's soon revealed that the return of the Black Flash isn't because of its unyielding duty to reap all speedsters, but rather to exterminate the other newly discovered forces, because they're killing the Speed Force. Now, this reveal from Williamson comes as a surprise for longtime readers, because up to this point, the only presence or force that we've seen to hurt the Speed Force is the negative Speed Force. And while the Black Flash has never come after Eobard Thawne, to the best of my knowledge, its aim at the new Force wielders can conveniently be explained by another of the laws of group theory, the law of closure. A group is said to have closure if and only if the application of any two elements in the group yield a result that already exists within the group. For example, going back to the symmetry group of triangle, if I apply a flip across the bottom right corner axis and then spin it 120 degrees, then it's the same result as if I had just flipped the original figure across its top corner axis. There's no combination of actions I could make that would give a result that isn't already described in the group. Any transformation with these 6 elements will only result in one of the other 6 elements. Now, bringing the conversation back to the 4 forces, what I interpreted from the Black Flash's chase after the new Force wielders was that the combination of their 3 forces could in fact create the negative Speed Force. Not only that, but the way that we see the Black Flash incessantly pursue the new Force wielders even after reaping the Sage Force avatar seems to imply that the negative Speed Force can still be made from the forces that remain. For example, applying one of the new forces to itself could, in theory, generate the negative Speed Force. And while I understand that this sounds absurd, there is some strong mathematical justification behind this idea through group theory. As both a mathematician and a dork that takes an unearthly form of pleasure in dissecting the mathematics behind comic book sci-fi, this idea that the new forces both combined and isolated can create the negative Speed Force is honestly mind-blowing. Because if this is truly the case, then what writer Joshua Williamson has done is effectively create a group structure that parallels a revolutionary group in mathematics called the Quaternions. Chapter 4: Quaternions and the 4 Forces. The Quaternion group was discovered by Irish mathematician William Rowan Hamilton, an astronomer, physicist, and mathematician who stumbled across the idea of this group while taking a walk with his wife one fateful day. When the theory struck him, he scrambled to jot down his ideas on anything he could get his hands on. And, as a result, he had to carve the following equation into the side of a bridge that happened to be nearby the trail that he and his wife were walking on. This context doesn't have anything to do with the group's relationship to the 4 forces. It's just a charming story I like to tell people who will listen. The equation Hamilton carved, however, is the source I'm specifically citing to justify the parallel between the structural relationship between the 4 forces and the Quaternions. In the Quaternion group, there are 8 different elements. 4 of these elements are the terms 1, I, J, and K, and the other 4 are their negative counterparts. At a glance, it's easy to overlap these 8 elements with the 4 forces, and their, admittedly theoretical, negative 4 forces. And it's Hamilton's carved equation that ends up describing the nature and behavior behind the Black Flash's unyielding hunt for the new Force avatars. If we switched out 1 for the Speed Force, I for the Strength Force, J for the Sage Force, and K for the Still Force, then we get the following theoretical behavior behind the mechanics of the 4 forces. Either applying the forces together, or to themselves in isolation, results in the generation of the negative Speed Force. And based on Williamson's story so far, this makes sense. Barry's internal monologue about his situation specifically accuses the new forces of killing the Speed Force, And given the only thing we've seen to really kill the Speed Force is its negative counterpart, then it's fair to conclude that the new forces amplify the power of the negative Speed Force in some way. For now. Conclusion: the Forever Force and the future of group theory. Now, at the time of writing this video, Williamson is still fleshing out a lot of the new force concepts he's introduced so far. And so these parallels between the four forces and the Quaternion group may wax and wane as time goes on. And in fact, with the concluding issues of Death and the Speed Force story arc, it already seems like Williamson is designing a different sort of structure behind how these four forces behave together. With the penultimate chapter of the arc, we see Hunter Zolomon reveal that his quest for these four forces has been driven by his desire to control the Forever Force, a force that manipulates time itself. With the enigmatic revelation of this fifth force, the group structure behind these cosmic forces becomes redesigned and even more mysterious from an analytical perspective. For example, while the parallels of the Quaternion group go out the window with the Forever Force, one of the integral laws of group theory, the law that states that for every group there must exist an identity element, like I mentioned earlier, suddenly has a place in this 5-element force structure. With only 4 forces, it seemed pretty clear that none of them could be the identity element, since none of them really leave much of each other unaffected. Heck, almost every story involving the 4 forces so far has revolved around the fact that their very existence has been messing with each other. But with a force all about the already constant and omnipresent power of time, I don't see how the Forever Force would need to tamper with the state of any of the other forces. But this is admittedly wishful thinking for a structure consistent with the properties of group theory. And for all the incomprehensible logic that tends to come with comic book lore and continuity, I find it pretty uplifting that there are still some clever ideas playing out that mimic the organization and complexity of university-level concepts. I really can't wait to see what comes next, and the design of how everything plays out.